The day after my grandpa's funeral, an HOA Karen stormed right into my 150-year-old ranch and handed me a bill for $750,000. She claimed I owed HOA fees worth half the entire ranch, threatening to have me arrested if I didn't pay. She waved forged documents and smugly measured my land, convinced she was staging a hostile takeover of a property my family built before this country even had all its states. But as she plotted to destroy my family's legacy, she had no idea she wasn't just picking a fight with a grieving grandson. She was threatening the single most powerful person in the entire state. What happens when a bully tries to bulldoze the one person who can write the laws? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because this is Justice Served Cold. Monday, 9:42 a.m. September 5th. The old Ford's engine ticked as it cooled in the long gravel driveway. I stood there, holding my grandfather's handwritten deed, the paper softened with age but the ink still dark and certain. The funeral was 2 days ago, a quiet affair for a quiet man. Now, I was home. Not my home, but the one that had always felt like the center of the world, Grandpa's ranch. 150 years old, the timber frame barn, still standing square against the wind, a testament to a time when things were built to last. I ran a hand along the top rail of the split-log fence. It was worn smooth as glass from a century and a half of weather and the hands of my ancestors. In the distance, a dozen head of cattle grazed peacefully, their tails swishing in the late summer air. The air itself smelled different out here of hay, earth, and the faint, clean scent of iron from the workshop. I walked over to the shed, the door creaking open on hinges Grandpa had oiled just a few months back. His tools hung in their proper places, each one clean, sharp, and ready. A brace and bit that belonged to my great-great-grandfather. A set of wrenches that still fit perfectly because Grandpa didn't buy cheap junk. He did things right, and the proof was everywhere you looked. This place was more than just land and buildings. It was a living record of hard work and quiet dignity. That's the peace I was soaking in, the first real moment of calm I'd felt since the phone call came. And then, it was shattered. A sharp, angry pounding echoed from the front of the house. Not a friendly knock, but a series of hard, flat smacks, like someone was trying to break the door down with their fist. I walked out of the shed, my boots crunching on the gravel, a knot tightening in my stomach. No one knocked like that out here. Before I even reached the porch, the door swung open, and a woman I'd never seen before was standing in my grandpa's living room. She hadn't even waited for an answer. She just barged right in. She was maybe in her late 50s, dressed in a crisp pantsuit that looked completely out of place against the rustic wood of the old farmhouse. Her hair was sprayed into a perfect helmet, and her face was a mask of pinched importance. She held a clipboard like a weapon. "Are you the new owner?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I stopped on the threshold, stunned by the sheer audacity. "I'm Mark Jensen. My grandfather was..." This was his ranch. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't introduce herself. She just marched forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the heart pine floors. She thrust a piece of paper at me from her clipboard. It was an official notice, printed in a loud, aggressive font, with bright red lettering at the top, that screamed, "Final Demand." She tapped a section with a long, manicured nail. "You are in serious violation of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association bylaws," she said, her voice dripping with condescending authority. "There are accumulated fees, fines, and penalties on this property totaling $750,000. I stared at her, then at the paper. It felt like a joke. A sick, cruel joke. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. This ranch has been in my family since 1872. There is no HOA out here." Her lips curled into a smug little smile. The kind that says, "I know something you don't." "Oh, there is," she said, "and you're part of it." The fees have been accumulating for years. Your grandfather, it seems, chose to ignore his civic obligations. We've been very patient." She pointed a trembling, indignant finger out the window. "Unregulated livestock, non-compliant fencing, an unapproved agricultural structure." She meant the 150-year-old barn. It all adds up. The bill stands at $750,000. According to the county assessor, that's about half of the ranch's worth. My mind was spinning. I'd spent 30 years as a firefighter, dealing with chaos and high-stakes situations. My first instinct was always to stay calm, to assess, to find the facts. But this was different. This was an invasion. This woman, this stranger, was standing in my grieving family's home, spitting nonsense, and trying to steal our legacy with a piece of paper. I looked at the notice again. The seal at the bottom looked off. Not like a proper county or state seal. It looked cheap, like something you'd print off a home computer. I finally found my voice. My grandfather owned this land free and clear. It predates every house in that subdivision by more than a century. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave my property. She let out a short, ugly laugh. I am Karen Whitfield, president of the HOA board. And you don't get to decide what the jurisdiction is. The bylaws are clear. Your property falls within the designated zone. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a tone of manufactured threat. I don't think you understand the situation you're in, Mr. Jensen. You have 1 week, 7 days. You either pay the outstanding balance, or we will have no choice but to start foreclosure proceedings. My calm was evaporating. You can't foreclose on a property you have no legal claim to. Her eyes narrowed into slits. Watch me, she hissed. We have the paperwork. We have the authority. You're just one man who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Pay up, or you will be removed. She turned on her heel and marched back toward the door she'd entered without permission. She paused on the porch and looked back at me, her face a perfect picture of smug triumph. And if you try to cause any trouble, if you think you can fight this, I'll call the sheriff myself and have you cited for trespassing by the end of the day. You have until next Monday. Don't be stupid. And then she was gone, leaving the screen door to slam shut behind her. The sound echoed in the sudden, deafening silence. I stood there, frozen, the bogus notice clutched in my hand. The peaceful air of my family's ranch felt poisoned. That woman wasn't just mistaken. She was a predator, and she had just declared war on the wrong man. For a long time after she left, I just stood there in the quiet house, the silence feeling heavier than before. The ridiculous piece of paper was still in my hand. $750,000. The number was so absurd it didn't even feel real. My first thought, the firefighter's instinct, was that this was a brush fire. Small, maybe, but if you don't contain it fast, it can burn down everything you own. Karen Whitfield was a fire, and she was trying to burn down 150 years of my family's history. I smoothed out the crumpled notice on the kitchen table and looked at it under the light. The seal was definitely fake. The font was something you'd find on a high school flyer, but the threat was real. Foreclosure. Removal. I walked over to my grandfather's old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room. He'd spent countless hours there, paying bills, writing letters, and keeping records. The man saved everything. He used to say, "Paper beats talk," every time. The desk smelled of old wood, ink, and tobacco from a pipe he hadn't smoked in 20 years. I started with the top drawers. Everything was in its place. Tax receipts going back to the 1950s, cattle sale records, equipment manuals. I moved to the deep file drawers at the bottom. Tucked in the very back of the bottom right drawer was a thick, leather-bound ledger. I pulled it out. The cover was worn, the title embossed in faded gold. Jensen Ranch, County Records, Surveys. I opened it carefully. Inside, protected by oiled paper, was a world of proof. There were Grandpa's handwritten notes, meticulous and clear. He'd logged every conversation with county officials, every permit filed, every property tax payment. And then, I found it. A certified copy of a county survey map, dated 1872. The surveyor's notes were written in elegant, swirling script. It clearly marked the 200 acres of the Jensen Ranch, detailing the property lines with landmarks that were still there. The old oak by the creek, the rock formation on the western ridge. There was no Oak Ridge Estates. There was nothing but ranch land for miles in every direction. Tucked behind the map was a county ordinance from 1989, the year the subdivision was built. A yellow sticky note in Grandpa's handwriting was attached to a specific paragraph. It read, Sec. 4, Paragraph B. All existing agricultural properties established prior to January 1, 1950 are exempt from HOA covenants. He knew. He had the proof right here all along. He must have figured these HOA people were just noise, a problem that would go away on its own. A wave of resolve washed over me, so strong it felt like my grandfather was standing right there in the room with me. This ranch stood before their bylaws, and it'll stand long after they're gone. The next morning, I took a copy of the ordinance and drove over to see Earl Thompson. Big Red, we all called him. His place was 2 miles down the road, another old farm that had been there forever. Earl was a Vietnam vet, a tough, straight-talking man of 74 who'd forgotten more about this county than most people ever knew. I found him in his workshop, fixing a piece of machinery that looked as old as he was. I laid the paper on his workbench. HOA trouble, huh? He grunted before I even said a word, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. I told him the whole story, Karen. The $750,000. The threats. He just nodded slowly, his face grim. That woman's a piece of work, he said. She tried to fine me 3 years ago for having a rusty tractor visible from the road. The road is a mile from her precious subdivision. He tapped the paper I'd brought. This is good, solid. The HOA has no authority over legacy ranch land. Period. It's been tested before. But be warned, Mark. Karen Whitfield doesn't care about the law. She only cares about winning. That small hope felt good, but his warning stuck with me. 2 days later, I found out just how right he was. I was out checking the fence line along the northern pasture when a shiny SUV pulled up my driveway, followed by a sedan. Karen Whitfield got out, but she wasn't alone this time. She had 2 of her board members with her, a nervous-looking woman, scribbling in a notepad, and a burly man who looked like he'd spent his life trying to look intimidating. He had a 20-foot measuring tape slung over his shoulder. This wasn't a conversation. This was an invasion force. I walked toward them, my face set. "You're trespassing," I said, my voice low and even. Karen held up another piece of paper, this one with a bold heading. Warrant of inspection. It looked even more fake than the first notice. "We have a warrant to inspect the property for code violations," she announced loudly, as if playing to an imaginary audience. The burly guy, Greg, took a step forward. "We just need to take some measurements. Check for setbacks." I stood my ground. "That's not a warrant. That's a piece of paper you printed. A real warrant is signed by a judge, and you'd have a sheriff's deputy with you. Now, all 3 of you need to get off my land." The woman, Anne, looked at Karen, her pen frozen over her notepad. For a second, I thought they might actually listen. But Karen's face hardened. "We are conducting our official business. You are interfering with an HOA investigation." They were staging a takeover. It hit me like a physical blow. The measuring tape, the fake warrant, the 2 flunkies, it was all a show. They were creating a fraudulent paper trail. They were trespassing to gather evidence for their made-up violations so they could put a lien on my ranch. This wasn't just a bluff. It wasn't an overzealous HOA president making a mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated crime. They were trying to steal my home. Get out, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but with an edge of cold steel that made even the big guy pause. Now. They stood there for another 10 seconds, a silent battle of wills playing out in the afternoon sun. Finally, Karen turned, her face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," she spat, and they piled back into their cars and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust. I watched them go, the dust settling slowly back onto the gravel. The peace of this place was gone, maybe forever. Everything felt different now, colder. This was my line in the sand. My grandpa built this place with his bare hands, and I buried him last week. They thought I was some grieving old man who would fold under pressure. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Nothing would ever be the same. But I won't be pushed. Week 2 began with a new routine. The quiet comfort of the ranch was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level hum of vigilance. I was a firefighter again, but instead of watching for smoke, I was watching for a silver SUV. I went into town and bought a small digital voice recorder, the kind a student might use for lectures. I kept it in my shirt pocket, always on, always ready. My phone became my primary weapon. Every time Karen or her board members drove past my property, and they did, slowly, like sharks circling, I took a photo. My phone automatically added the date, time, and GPS location to each picture. I started a logbook, just like we used at the fire station. A simple spiral notebook on the kitchen counter. Every entry was precise. Tuesday, September 13th, 10:15 a.m. Silver SUV, license plate XYZ 123, parked across the road for 4 minutes. Driver, K. Whitfield. Wednesday, September 14th, 2:30 p.m. Received certified letter from HOA. Refused to sign. Letter left on porch. I documented everything. Every car, every letter, every phone call that came from a blocked number and then hung up. I was building a fortress. Not of stone, but of facts. One evening, I was back at my grandfather's desk, going through his files again. I laid Karen's official notice next to a legitimate county tax assessment from the previous year. Under the lamplight, the difference was stark. The seal on the county document was crisp and detailed. You could clearly see the outline of our state's official bird and the motto etched in tiny letters. I had to squint, but it was there. Then I looked at the seal on Karen's demand letter. It was a generic eagle, the kind you could buy on a rubber stamp at an office supply store. The text around it just said official county seal, with no county name. It was a cheap, lazy forgery. And that's when I had her. Cold. Forgery of an official seal is a felony. This wasn't a civil dispute over bylaws anymore. This was a crime. I took a high-resolution photo of the two seals side by side. The first brick in her wall had just crumbled. My small victory didn't last long. 2 days later, a county sheriff's patrol car pulled into my driveway. I'd been expecting it. I watched from the window as 2 deputies got out. They weren't moving aggressively. They were cautious, professional. I stepped out onto the porch before they had a chance to knock. "Afternoon, officers," I said calmly. The older deputy, a man with a tired but steady look, nodded. "Sir, we received a call about a trespasser on this property. A Ms. Karen Whitfield reported a man refusing to leave. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. That's what she wanted. I simply nodded. I'm Mark Jensen. This was my grandfather's ranch. He passed last week. I'm the executor of his estate and the sole heir. Please, come inside. I can show you the paperwork." They exchanged a quick look. This wasn't the reaction they were expecting from a supposed trespasser. I led them into the kitchen and offered them a seat at the table, which they politely declined. I laid out the documents in a neat row. The original deed from 1872, my grandfather's will, my own driver's license, matching the name. I then showed them a copy of an email I had sent to the HOA a few days prior, formally stating that they were not to enter my property without a court order, complete with a timestamp. Finally, I showed them the two documents, the real tax bill and the forged notice. The woman who called you served me this, I said, pointing to Karen's letter. As you can see, she's using a counterfeit county seal to threaten me. The younger deputy leaned in for a closer look. He glanced at his partner. The air in the room shifted. They weren't investigating a trespassing call anymore. They were looking at evidence of a serious crime. The older deputy cleared his throat. Mr. Jensen, we are required to respond to every call. It appears Miss Whitfield may have misrepresented the situation. I understand completely, officer. You're just doing your job. He gave me a thin, appreciative smile. Thank you for being cooperative. We won't trouble you any further. Sorry for your loss, sir. They left as quietly as they came. Through the window, I watched them talk in their car for a few minutes before driving away. Another small win. But I knew Karen. A public embarrassment like this wouldn't make her back down. It would make her angrier. The next 48 hours were quiet. Too quiet. I knew she was planning something. Friday night, around midnight, my old dog started barking. Not his usual rabbit-in-the-yard bark, but a low, serious growl. I got up and went to the living room window. A pair of headlights cut a swath across the pasture before turning sharply and speeding away down the main road. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from by the door and went outside. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The dog was still growling, his eyes fixed on the barn. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the front of the house, the shed, the fence line. Nothing. Then I pointed it at the barn. My grandfather's barn. The heart of this ranch. My blood ran cold. There, nailed directly to the big double doors, was a sign. It was huge, at least 4 feet by 4 feet, and painted a garish, violent red. In thick, white, stenciled letters, it read, Violation. Property seized by order of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. It was an obscene scar on 150 years of history. A declaration of war, nailed to my door in the dead of night. She hadn't just crossed a line. She had burned the whole map. The next morning, the sun came up on that ugly red sign. The nails they'd used were long and thick, driven deep into the old barnwood. It took me a good 20 minutes with a pry bar to get it down without splintering the door too badly. I laid the sign on the ground, a 4x4 monument to petty hatred. I took photos of it from every angle, documenting the damage to the barn. This was no longer just about paper threats. This was vandalism. This was a physical assault on my home. I knew then I couldn't fight this alone. Documenting everything was smart, but I wasn't a lawyer or a property expert. Karen was banking on me not knowing the rules. It was time to call in someone who did. I called my old friend, Tom Alvarez. Tom had been a county engineer for 40 years before he retired. He was the guy who knew every regulation, every code, and every loophole in the book because he'd helped write half of them. He was methodical, quiet, and one of the most honest men I'd ever met. He lived about 30 minutes away. When I explained the situation, he just said, "I'll be there in an hour. Have coffee on." He arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase and a small pocket notebook he took everywhere. I laid everything out on the kitchen table. My grandfather's deed and survey map, the county ordinance he'd bookmarked, my logbook of Karen's harassment, the photos of the fake seal, and the big red sign I'd dragged onto the back porch. Tom didn't say a word for nearly half an hour. He just sat there, reading each document carefully, making small, precise notes in his little book. He used a pocket magnifier to examine the forged seal, then the real one. He held the two up to the light, nodding slowly. Finally, he sat back, took a slow sip of his coffee, and looked at me. "Mark," he said, his voice calm and steady, "what she's doing is not just illegal, it's impossible. He tapped the thick stack of papers that made up the HOA's bylaws, which Karen had included in one of her certified mail packages. Trying to apply these subdivision rules to a 150-year-old ranch, he said, pausing to find the right words, is like trying to nail clouds to the sky. It can't be done. He explained it in plain language. A property's rights are established when it's created. My family's ranch was established in 1872. The law that allowed for this HOA to even exist wasn't written until over a century later. The ranch is legally firewalled from the HOA's authority by time itself. It's a fundamental principle of property law. Her claims were built on nothing. She's betting on intimidation, not legality, Tom concluded. But we need more than just proof you're right. We need proof she knows she's wrong. And that's where the tide truly began to turn. Tom had a contact, a woman on the HOA's Architectural Review Committee who was sick of Karen's bullying. She'd been quietly keeping records, waiting for the right moment. Tom made a call. An hour later, an email landed in his inbox. He pulled his tablet from his briefcase and opened the file. It was a chain of emails between Karen and her board members from 3 weeks ago, right after her first visit to my ranch. He turned the screen toward me, his finger pointing to a message from Karen Whitfield herself. I read it, and the room went cold. It said, "He's an old man, grieving and alone. He won't know the rules. If we press him hard with fines and violations, he'll fold. He'll sell cheap just to make it go away. The ranch is worth more to a developer than the fines, but the fines are our leverage." I read it again. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an error. It was a conspiracy to commit fraud, written down in black and white. She knew she had no legal standing. Her goal was to harass me into selling my family's land. This was the smoking gun. That evening, I called a meeting. Big Red, the Thompson family from down the way, and 4 other families who owned legacy properties bordering the subdivision. I even invited a couple who lived inside Oak Ridge Estates, who I knew were fed up with Karen's reign. We met in Big Red's big, drafty barn. I laid out all the evidence on a long folding table. The deed, the ordinance, the forged seal. And finally, I read Karen's email out loud. The silence that followed was heavy. Then, Big Red slammed his fist on the table, making a coffee can jump. "That witch!" he growled. The others erupted. They'd all been targeted by her for years, with petty fines for grass being too long or the wrong color of mailbox. But this was different. This was a criminal plot. They cheered when I finished. They were all in. They offered to write sworn statements about their own harassment. They were ready to stand with me, to testify, to finally put an end to her. I drove home that night, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. I wasn't alone anymore. We had the truth, we had the proof, and we had the community. The next morning, I went to the bank to handle some estate matters, feeling confident and clear-headed. I slid the withdrawal slip to the teller, a friendly woman I'd known for years. She typed my information into her computer, and her smile faltered. She typed it again. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice dropping. "There seems to be a problem with the account." My stomach tightened. What kind of problem? She looked uncomfortable, leaning in to speak softly. "The account has been frozen. There's a lien on it. It was filed yesterday by the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." Just like that, the air was sucked out of my lungs. Karen had bypassed the law, bypassed the courts, and gone straight for my financial throat. While I was gathering my neighbors, she was filing fraudulent papers to cut off my access to my own money. The fight wasn't just on paper anymore. She was trying to starve me out. Week 6. The say. 11:30 a.m. The polite, air-conditioned quiet of the bank felt 1,000 miles away from the honest dust and sun of the ranch. The teller's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Frozen. Lien." I asked to speak to the manager. He was a young man, sharp suit, trying his best to be helpful but hemmed in by the rules on his computer screen. He led me to a small glass office and pulled up the file. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jensen," he said, tapping his screen. "It's a UCC-1 filing from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. It claims a significant debt against the property and, by extension, its assets. It effectively freezes everything until it's resolved in court." My hands were cold. I could feel a tremor starting in my fingers. This was her endgame. Cut off my money, so I couldn't hire a lawyer. Starve me out so I'd be forced to sell the land for pennies just to eat. It was a vicious, brilliant move. I asked to see a copy of the filing. He printed it out. It was another one of her cheap forgeries, filled with legal-sounding nonsense, citing bylaws that didn't apply and fines that had been invented out of thin air. But it had been stamped and filed with the county clerk. To the banking system, it looked real enough to trigger their automatic security protocols. As the manager handed me the papers, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a small date stamp at the bottom of the page. "This looks fishy. The filing date is yesterday, but in our system, the freeze was activated based on a notice dated last week. The paperwork dates don't match the system log. Someone might have backdated this. You should have a lawyer look at this right away." It was a tiny crack of light in a very dark room. A mistake. In her rush to trap me, Karen had gotten sloppy, but it was small comfort. The trap was still sprung. The drive back to the ranch was a blur. The fields, the trees, the familiar curve of the road, I saw none of it. My mind was a storm of worry. How was I going to pay the property taxes? Buy feed for the cattle? Just pay the light bill? For the first time, a genuine, piercing fear took hold. I wasn't just going to lose a fight. I was going to lose the ranch. Everything my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and all the Jensens before them had worked and sweat and bled for, I was going to lose it to a bitter woman with a printer and a grudge. I walked into the old house. The silence was overwhelming. I went to the living room and stood in front of my grandfather's armchair. It was worn leather, cracked and softened, in the exact shape of the man who had sat in it for 60 years. The imprint of his shoulders was still there. I sank into it, and the old leather sighed around me. And that's when the dam broke. I put my head in my hands, and the fight just went out of me. It was too much. The grief from the funeral I hadn't let myself feel. The relentless pressure, the constant vigilance, the humiliation of having my name and my family's legacy dragged through the mud. It all came crashing down. I felt like a failure. He had trusted me to protect this place. It was the only thing he'd ever asked of me. And I was failing. Footsteps on the porch. Not a knock this time. Just the heavy, arrogant stomp of Karen Whitfield. The screen door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the doorway with the sun behind her, a dark silhouette of smug victory. She didn't come in. She just stood there, gloating. "I see you got the notice from the bank," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Things can get so complicated when you don't follow the rules. But don't you worry, Mark. We'll be taking possession soon. You'll be out by Christmas. Maybe you can find a nice little apartment in town." I just stared at her from the chair. Empty. I had nothing left to say. No fight left in me. I was beaten. She had won. She stood there for a moment longer, savoring her triumph. I looked at her, at this small, petty tyrant who had manufactured a crisis to steal a home, and thought about the world she was trying to build, one of rules made up on the spot, and power taken without consent. And then, something shifted. It was like a switch being flipped in a dark room. My exhaustion, my grief, my fear, it all burned away in a sudden, clarifying flash of cold anger. It was the memory of a different set of rules, a different kind of power. I thought about the endless meetings, the town halls, the debates, the handshakes, the thousands of miles I'd driven across this state over the last 2 years, the election I had just won a few weeks earlier. A piece of my life I had kept separate from the ranch. A promise I had made to the people of this state to fight for them. My inauguration was next week. I slowly got to my feet, the exhaustion gone, replaced by a granite-hard resolve. Karen took a small step back, her smug smile faltering for the first time. She had made a critical mistake. She had picked a fight with a retired firefighter who had just inherited his family ranch. But she had no idea what that firefighter was about to become. Because on Inauguration Day, she wouldn't be dealing with Mark Jensen, grieving grandson. She would be dealing with Governor Mark Jensen. And the laws she was twisting to her own purpose, I was about to be the man who signed them. Inauguration Day. The air was crisp and cold. The sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I stood on the steps of the state capitol, my hand on a Bible that had been in my family since before the ranch was founded. My left hand, my right hand, the one I raised to take the oath of office, was calloused and scarred from decades of pulling hoses and wielding axes. But it was steady. As the Chief Justice administered the oath, I could see my neighbors in the crowd. Big Red was there, a proud grin on his face, standing next to Tom Alvarez, who gave me a slow, respectful nod. They were watching on behalf of everyone who had ever been pushed around, fined, or threatened by a petty tyrant on a power trip. They were watching for my grandfather. When I said the words, "So help me God," a quiet sense of rightness settled over me. It wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. I'd spent my life running toward fires. This was just a different kind of fire. My inaugural address was short and to the point. I spoke about fairness, about protecting the rights of ordinary citizens, and about how government should be a shield for the people, not a sword to be used against them. As I was wrapping up, my staff had arranged a short meet-and-greet line on the Capitol lawn for local officials and community leaders. The press cameras were still rolling, broadcasting live across the state, and that's when I saw her, Karen Whitfield, pushing her way through the crowd with an almost manic intensity. She was dressed in her finest power suit, clipboard in hand, a look of absolute triumph on her face. She clearly had no idea who she was about to confront. To her, I was still just the broken man in the armchair. She must have thought this was her moment of ultimate victory, to serve me with a final demand in front of the local news, to humiliate me on the very day I should have been celebrating. She cut in front of a city councilman, thrusting a thick envelope at me. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice loud and theatrical for the cameras. "This is the final demand letter from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Your time is up." The reporters, smelling drama, began to move closer. Their cameras focused in on her, then on me. My security detail tensed, ready to step in, but I gave them a subtle shake of the head. I took the envelope from her. I didn't even look at it. I just held it in my hand and turned to the nearest microphone, which was still live. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," I said, my voice calm and clear, ringing out across the lawn. "Thank you for being here today. It seems my first official act as governor is an unexpected one." I held up the envelope. "This is a demand letter from a homeowners association. It's a fine example of a problem that thousands of citizens in our great state face every single day. Good, hard-working people who are being harassed, intimidated, and defrauded by corrupt and overreaching HOAs that operate with little to no oversight." I looked directly at Karen. Her smug expression had vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed confusion. The color was draining from her face as the reality of the situation began to dawn on her. The cameras were now all pointed at her. These organizations were meant to protect property values, not to be used as personal kingdoms for bullies to forge documents, file fraudulent liens, and attempt to steal property from grieving families. I paused, letting the words sink in. "Therefore, my first executive order, which I will sign this afternoon, establishes a new state-level task force on HOA corruption. It will have full investigative and subpoena power to audit the financials and review the complaints against every single HOA in this state. I looked back at Karen, my voice dropping but still carrying clearly over the microphone. And this task force's very first investigation, starting today, will be into the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Karen just stood there, frozen, the clipboard slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the pavement. And then, I delivered the final blow. I turned to Sheriff Ray Collins, who I'd made sure was standing nearby. He'd seen the evidence. He'd gotten the call from the bank manager about the fraudulent lien. He knew the whole story. "Sheriff," I said, "I believe you'll find that this woman has committed multiple felonies, including the forgery of an official county seal and the filing of a fraudulent financial instrument. Please do your duty." Sheriff Collins didn't hesitate. He was a good man who had been embarrassed by her lies once before. This was justice for him, too. He stepped forward, his face impassive. "Karen Whitfield," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you are under arrest for fraud and forgery." He took her arm, and in the sudden, shocking silence of the Capitol lawn, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was as loud as a gunshot. The sound cue was perfect. Big Red let out a whoop from the crowd, and a wave of spontaneous, joyful applause erupted. The reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, as Karen, her face a mask of utter disbelief and humiliation, was led away in handcuffs by the sheriff. It wasn't revenge, it was a rebalancing of the scales. She had used fake authority to try and ruin my life. I had just used real authority to end her reign of terror for everyone. 3 months later, the dust had settled, both literally on the ranch and figuratively in the state capitol. Karen Whitfield's dramatic arrest on the Capitol lawn had been the lead story on the news for a week. The task force I created went to work with a vengeance, and the Oak Ridge Estates HOA was their first and most thorough investigation. It was like pulling a single loose thread and watching the entire rotten tapestry unravel. Investigators, armed with subpoenas and search warrants, found everything. They found the cheap rubber stamp Karen used to forge the county seal. They found the files on her computer with dozens of templates for fake warrants and violation notices. They interviewed the other board members, Anne, Louise, and Greg, who folded like cheap lawn chairs under the first sign of real legal pressure. They turned over years of emails and financial records that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She had been shaking down dozens of residents for years, especially the older ones, hitting them with bogus fines for things like non-approved garden gnomes or improperly shaded window panes, collecting thousands of dollars in illegal fees that went into an unaudited slush fund. Her email admitting her plan to harass me into selling my land was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Faced with a mountain of evidence and testimony from her own board members, Karen's fight was over before it began. She resigned from the HOA in disgrace. An hour before the board was scheduled to vote her out, the court proceedings were swift. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had seen it all, called Karen's actions a predatory campaign of malice and greed, disguised as civic order. The HOA, under new court-appointed leadership, was ordered to pay back a total of $1.2 million in restitution to every homeowner who had been illegally fined over the last decade. My bank account was unfrozen the day after her arrest, the fraudulent lien declared null and void. The story was a simple one, of a bully who finally picked on the wrong person. But looking back, I know I only won because I followed a few simple, practical steps. First, I checked the facts. Karen's entire case was built on lies, and my grandfather's old ledger, with the county records and maps, was the truth. You have to compare what the HOA claims with what the official county records say. The paper trail is your best friend. Second, I documented everything. Every visit, every letter, every threat. My little logbook and the pictures on my phone, all with dates and times, created an undeniable record of her harassment. When it was her word against mine, I had a pile of receipts. A bully's power is in making you feel confused and alone. Facts are the antidote. And third, and maybe most important, I never faced her alone. I tried to, at first, and it nearly broke me. But the moment I brought in my expert friend, Tom Alvarez, and gathered my neighbors, the power shifted. We weren't a collection of individual targets anymore. We were a community. Bullies thrive on isolation. They can't win against a united front. This whole ordeal taught me something profound. You can't vote against gravity, and you can't bully the truth. The truth is heavy. It has weight. You can try to hide it or twist it, but eventually its weight will bring everything else crashing down. Today, the ranch is quiet again, the good kind of quiet. I spent a weekend fixing the barn door where Karen's ugly red sign had been. The nail holes are still there, deep scars in the old wood. I filled them with wood putty, sanded them smooth, and put a fresh coat of linseed oil on the entire door. I thought about replacing the boards, but decided against it. They're part of the ranch's story now. A reminder that it was tested, and it endured. I took down the old, faded sign my grandfather had up and painted a new one. I used simple, clean, white letters on a dark green background. It just says, Jensen Ranch. Built 1872. Still standing. This evening I'm hosting a barbecue. The whole neighborhood is here. Big Red is manning the grill, telling a story that's making everyone laugh. Tom is explaining something about water rights to a young couple from the subdivision who are listening with rapt attention. The kids are chasing fireflies in the pasture as the sun sets, their laughter mixing with the lowing of the cattle. There's no fear here anymore. No one is worried about the color of their mailbox or the height of their grass. They're just neighbors, free. I look out at the scene, at the life and light filling this place that so nearly went dark, and I feel my grandfather's presence. The peace has returned. The ranch is safe. The legacy is secure. And justice, it turns out, is the best inheritance of all.